Europe's role in East Asian islands dispute. China has snubbed Japan by setting up its new air defenses zone near disputed islands in the East China Sea. The situation also affects the EU. What can Europe do? Beijing recently announced the establishment of an air defenses identification zone, a new measure that could deepen the territorial dispute with Tokyo over an island chain in the East China Sea. Chinese fighter jets may now intercept Japanese aircraft flying over the disputed territory. Japan has reacted angrily. A senior Japanese foreign ministry official lodged a protest with the Chinese embassy in Tokyo, saying that Japan could never accept the zone set up by China. Similar air defense zones set up by Japan, South Korea and Taiwan on the East China Sea also exist. These zones overlapped in several places. Liu Zhenyong, professor of international relations at Tsinghua University, says that China is only catching up other countries in this area. I am of the opinion that China has set up the air defenses zone too late, the Chinese expert told DW. Small islands, big consequences. The islands, which are called Senkaku in Japan and Diaoyu in China, has a total area of about 7 square kilometers. The dispute is primarily about who has sovereignty over the islands. However, it's also about rich fishing grounds, mineral resources, and access to key international sea lanes passing through the archipelago. The conflict is also fueled by rising nationalism on both sides. A study by the German Institute for International and Security Affairs (SWP) states mutual resentment limits the ability of both Chinese and the Japanese governments to make compromises to resolve the dispute over the island chain. Since there is no institutionalized system for dealing with maritime incidents, there is a big risk of the conflict escalating. And this would have global consequences. Because of its security deal with Japan, the United States would have to intervene. U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel confirmed this. We remain steadfast in our commitment to our allies and partners. It's difficult to measure the impact an escalation of the conflict might have on the world economy. As 3 of the world's largest economies, the United States, China, and Japan, are involved in it, but also German and European economic interests would be affected, according to a report published by the SWP. The report states that trade with East Asia accounted for more than a quarter of total EU trade in 2012. The EU would therefore have good reasons for defending its interests in the East China Sea. Europe as a mediator, but the EU has followed a restrained approach. According to the SWP report, the EU has restricted itself to calling on both sides to settle the dispute peacefully. However, the SWP experts believe the EU could do more, as it is not directly involved in the conflict, unlike the United States and East Asian countries. The institute, which also advises Germany's parliament and federal government, suggested, for these reasons, it is important for the EU to act preemptively. This requires that the Union intensifies its political ties with East Asia. A strategy for East Asia must be drafted in the interest of the EU, the document adds. Arbitration could first take place on a low level, starting with, for instance, scientists, former political decision makers, members for civil society, or between government officials and non-official representatives. The SWP report ends with the following sentence. This way, the EU could make a name for itself as an independent player in the region, between the USA and China. Skepticism about EU's role. Edward Schwach, Asia expert at the London-based Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, agrees that there's a lot at stake for the EU. But Schwach is skeptical about the potential European involvement. There are already too many players involved in the dispute in the East China Sea. I don't see what the EU will be able to contribute. Furthermore, it will be difficult to justify such a move vis the states in the region, particularly China. Schwartz explains that Beijing has always insisted on bilateral negotiation and pronounced itself against international solution. The expert therefore believed that the EU would cause more problems than it would solve. Instead, he argues, the EU should speak out in favor of freedom of navigation and against unilateral attacks on the sovereignty of any nation. Japan's new defenses approach. In an attempt to curb China's hegemonic ambitions, Japanese Premier Shinzo Abe is set on strengthening his country's security ties with the United States. But the new approach is poisoning the political climate at home. This week, all eyes in East Asia are set on Joe Biden. On Tuesday, December 2nd, the U.S. Vice President is set to meet with Japanese Premier Shinzo Abe in Tokyo to discuss about how to deal with China's newly declared air defense zone, before traveling to Beijing and Seoul for similar talks. Each of Biden's statements in the Japanese capital will be closely monitored, as Japan fears its sole security partner, the United States, might deviate from its own hard line. The State Department recently unnerved Tokyo when it advises U.S. commercial airlines to notify Chinese authorities of flight plans when traveling through the new air defense zone. The zone covers an area which includes the disputed islands known as the Senkaku in Japan and the Diaoyu in China. All Nippon Air and Japan Airlines are currently following a request from the Japanese government not to submit flight plans to China for any plans due to flying over that area. Washington reaffirmed, however, that it was not acknowledging China's new air defense zone. A new interpretation. The escalation in the East China Sea essentially plays into the hands of Premier Abe. Despite pacifist resistance, the nationalist politician is set on strengthening Japan's defenses. Politically, this is said to happen through the constitution. However, since Abe lacks a majority, the premier is apparently no longer planning to change the constitution directly, but rather to reinterpret its Article 9. The pacifism clause in the article forbids Japan from waging war unless the country is under attack. The new interpretation is designed to allow Japanese troops to actively defend their ally, the United States, following China's foray into the East China Sea. Abe's goals of loosening the limits of Japan's pacifist constitution could meet with more approval from the population. At the same time, Japan is preparing to react militarily to China's growing hegemonic ambitions. The details are scheduled to be announced by the end of the year, but the essential features are already becoming apparent. First of all, the country wants to spend more on defenses, despite its soaring national debt. After a 0.7% hike this year, Japan's defense ministry is seeking a further 3% rise in defense spending for the coming year, thus increasing the military budget to a total of 50 billion USD, some 37 billion euros. Secondly, the government wants to invest more in the country's air, missiles, and coastal defenses. In return, the number of tanks is expected to shrink within the next decade by 60% to 300. The bulk of the tanks are to be deployed on the islands of Kyushu and Hokkaido on the outer edges of the country. A security cooperation with Russia is set to take some pressure off Japan's northern flank and allow Japanese defenses to focus on a potential Chinese threat coming from the south. With this new defensive strategy, Japan's conservative government wants to make a name for itself as a reliable U.S. partner on an equal footing. For this same reason, Premier Abe recently created a National Security Council based on the U.S. model, where all relevant pieces of information coverage. This way, Abe argues, Japan is able to react faster to developments regarding foreign and security policy. A controversial bill. The U.S. might also take its junior partner more seriously now that Abe's ruling coalition pushed a controversial state secrets bill through the lower house of parliament. In Japan, classified information is leaked to the public so fast that U.S. diplomats and military personnel normally share only few documents with their Japanese allies. Japan is viewed as a paradise for spies. Lengthy prison sentences in Japan are now said to deter whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden, but at the same time, the new measures are increasing political tensions. The Secrecy Protection Bill essentially limits contacts between journalists and government officials. The bill speaks only of certain security-relevant secrets and fails to specify what kind of secrets it refers to. Furthermore, there seems to be no clear parliamentary oversight. Rights activists and journalists therefore warn that Japan might be turning into a politic state and relapsing into the nationalism of the 1930s. Protests as acts of terrorism. Critics said they feared that the government might classify information regarding, for instance, nuclear accidents like the one in Fukushima as secret. Premier Abe has indicated that he is willing to react to criticism before the upper house of parliament votes on the bill later this week. Thus far, Abe has refused to accept any changes, but as the current parliamentary term ends this Friday, December 6, Abe apparently fears that his bill might fail. But the political climate in Japan is already poisoned. In his blog, the Secretary General of Abe's Liberal Democratic Party (LDP), Shigeru Ishiba, recently labeled the protests against the bill as acts of terrorism. He later softened his statement by saying he was referring to the noise made by the demonstrators, but the opposition now feels its suspicions have been reinforced that Abe wants to curtail fundamental democratic freedom. Mizuho Fukushima, deputy chief of Japan's Social Democratic Party (SDP), recently said one could not trust a government with members such as Ishiba. Police violence in Ukraine strengthens oppositions. Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych has continued to lose support following police violence against demonstrations in Kyiv. The EU have appealed to Ukraine to respect citizenship, freedom of speech and assembly. Opponents of the Ukrainian government are putting increasing pressure on President Viktor Yanukovych, forming blockades aimed at preventing government officials from entering their offices at City Hall and other locations on Monday. They also built tents in central Kyiv for around 5,000 of those who took part in massive protests on Sunday. The country reports that more than 150 people were injured in clash between the demonstrators and police officers. Andres Umland, a political scientist currently teaching at the University of Kyiv, suggested that the police action was in fact a test by the government to see how far it could go. If this was indeed the case, the policies has seriously backfired. He says emotions grew especially raw among protesters following media reports claiming a demonstrator had died of his injuries on Saturday night. Those who know the country well say it is unusual for the police to employ such violent measures against protesters. Opposition parliamentarian Andriy Shevchenko told that German news agency that Ukraine has never experienced anything like it. But President Yanukovych's violent responses has only fanned the flames of popular fury. Opposition closed ranks. The initial protests were directed against Yanukovych's European policy. At the recent European Union summit on partnership with its eastern neighbors, Ukraine backed away, at least for the time being, from an association agreement being negotiated with the EU. Under pressure from Russia, shortly before the meeting, Yanukovych announced that he would not be signing the long-awaited free trade agreement. Russia is Ukraine's biggest trading partner and main source of gas. It is pushing for Ukraine to become a member of a customs union including Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, and oppose Ukraine opening its borders to EU products. Georgia and Moldova did, however, pen agreements which bring the two countries closer to the European Union. Yanukovych's decision to back out the agreement may cost him his office, and Andreas Emlant believed that if it carries on like this, there will be a change of government. This might then put the opposition in the position of forming a transitional government. The three opposition parties, Bankivshchina, Undar, and Svoboda, had joined forces to form an action committees of national resistance. In an interview with DW, Kirill Savin, the director of Heinrich Boyle Foundation in Kyiv, explained their political power balance. Arseny Yatensyuk of the Bankivshchina party effectively leads the opposition, he said, although the Udar party is ahead in polls. Udar's leader, the boxer Vitaly Klitschko, has not been around enough, says Savin, pointing to the leader's absence even during the protest. Omland believes that Klitschko could nonetheless become president. He certainly sees the coalition between the parties as having strengthened the opposition, as they have in any case been working together since 2012. Yanukovych stalking confusion. President Yanukovych even seems to be losing support within his own party, although he has denied having anything to do with the police violence against the demonstrators. Many allied parliamentarians appears not to believe him and have announced their departure from the party. The head of the presidential office is believed to be among them. The situation is becoming increasingly chaotic. Reports are coming in thick and fast at the moment, and we don't have precise information, Omland told DW. But the government seems to be in a state of panic. It has been confirmed that the head of the Kiev police has taken responsibility for the violence and stepped down. However, Omlet said Yankovich used him as a scapegoat. The police force in Ukraine is not autonomous as it is in South America, for example, he said. Umlet believes that the president initiated the violent police action. EU criticism. The EU has demanded an explanation. Foreign policy chef Catherine Ashton released a statement saying the European Union strongly condemns the excessive use of force by the police in Kiev to disperse peaceful protesters, who over the last days in a strong and unprecedented manners have expressed their support for Ukraine's political association and economic integration with the EU. Omelette is urging the EU to step in. It has to make clear to Russia that the pressure it is exerting on Ukraine is not acceptable, he said, adding that claim would only return to the streets of Kiev once the agreement with the EU has been signed. This is important, he says, primarily because Ukraine is the current chair of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. The conference of OSCE ministers is due to take place in Kiev on December 5 and 6. The EU is therefore calling on Ukraine to comply with international violations and respect its citizens' freedom of speech and assembly. Chaos in Bangkok. Stones, tear gas, and water canoes. Tensions in Thailand's capital are rising, as clashes between anti-government protesters and the military continued on Monday, December 2nd. The situation is increasingly tense. Demonstrators throw stones at the police in an attempt to bring the situation under control. Security forces respond by using tear gas and water canoes, assisting the injured. Military medical teams are on the scene assisting the wounded. The chemicals used cause a feeling of choking as well as of stinging and burning of the eyes. Paramedics carries around stretchers to help the injured. At least 4 people have died, according to the Thai authorities. The protests are taking part mainly in the government district, located only 2 kilometers from the royal palace. Sealed off, with concrete barriers and barbed wire, the military sealed off government buildings. Some 2,000 demonstrators came together on Monday, after some 30,000 protesters have tried to storm the center of government on Sunday. Prior to the weekend, demonstrations had been largely peaceful. Who's calling the shots? Critics consider Yingluck Shinawatra to be a puppet of her brother. They believe Taiskin is the one calling the shots from his self-imposed exile in Dubai. Tenzin was premier between 2001 and 2006 before being ousted from power by members of the military loyal to the king. The former PM left the country to avoid a prison sentence for corruption conviction.